The morning Harlan Gaines rode across her property line, Eleanor Voss was already awake. She had been awake since 4, the way she was always awake, before the light came, not from anxiety, not from the restless grief that had kept her sleepless in those first months after Niels died, but from habit. The habit of a woman alone on 160 acres who had learned that the hours before dawn were the most honest hours of the day. The hours when the land told you the truth about itself and you either listened or you didn't. She was stacking the last of the firewood against the eastern wall of the barn when she heard his horse on the frozen ground. The sound carried far in that kind of cold. It was already 12 below zero and the sun had barely cleared the horizon, painting the Dakota prairie in shades of iron and amber that would have been beautiful if she hadn't learned to read them as warning. 4 years on this claim had taught her to read the sky the way other people read a newspaper, not for pleasure, but for information, for the specific intelligence that determined whether the next 24 hours would be manageable or catastrophic. Harlan Gaines was 45 years old and had lived on the Dakota frontier for 23 years. He was not a man who rode fast without reason. He pulled up his gray mare 20 feet from where she stood and looked down at her from beneath the brim of his fur cap with an expression she had only seen on his face once, before the winter of 1879, when the Jensen boy had gone missing in a ground blizzard, and they'd found him 3 days later, frozen solid in a coulee 2 miles from his own front door. "Barometer at the trading post," Harlan said. His breath came out in thick white clouds that the still air held for a moment before dispersing. "Dropped faster this morning than I've seen it drop in 23 years out here. The sky to the northwest is that color. You know the color I mean." Eleanor knew the color. The old-timers called it Widowmaker light, a greenish gray that sat low on the horizon like a bruise on the belly of the world, a color that had no equivalent in any other season or any other kind of weather. She had seen it twice in her 4 years on this claim. The first time a man named Driscoll lost his entire cattle herd in a single night. The second time the storm that followed killed 8 people across 3 counties in 48 hours and left drifts so deep that some of the smaller homesteads weren't found until the April thaw. "How long?" she asked. "Maybe 6 hours before the leading edge hits. Less if the wind picks up the way I think it will." He looked at her with the steady attention of a man delivering information he knows will matter. "Bring your stock inside, Eleanor. Every last one of them. And then I'd suggest you stay inside yourself." She nodded once. She was already turning toward the barn door. "Eleanor." His voice stopped her. Something in the particular gravity of it, not alarm exactly, but the weight of a man who has seen enough of this landscape to know what it is capable of. "This one is going to be a killer." She looked back at him. "I know," she said. "Thank you, Harlan." He rode back the way he had come, and Eleanor Voss stood for one moment in the thin November sunlight, her gloved hands at her sides, and looked at the northwestern sky. Then she turned and went into the barn, and as she moved through the familiar space, checking feed bins and water troughs, her eyes kept returning to the northern wall, to the stacked hay bales and hanging harnesses that concealed a heavy plank door set into what appeared to be solid construction, to what she had built behind that door over 14 months of solitary secret labor, to the thing none of them had believed in. She would find out today whether she had been right or whether she had been a fool. There was a particular kind of peace in that knowledge. The uncertainty, 14 months of it, heavy and constant, as the Dakota sky was finally irrevocably over. She had done the math. She had checked it 100 times. Now the math would be tested by something that did not care about calculations at all. Something that had been shaping and breaking and killing on this prairie long before the first homesteader arrived, with their certainties and their inadequate shelters and their fundamental misunderstanding of what this land required. This is the story of how Eleanor Voss built a shelter that saved 17 lives during 43 hours of the worst blizzard in Dakota Territory history. But to understand what she built, you first have to understand why she built it. And to understand why, you have to go back 14 months back to a piece of paper she found in the Yankton Library on a Tuesday afternoon in September of 1881, while the last of the summer heat was still rising off the prairie in visible waves, and the idea of a killing blizzard seemed as distant as the moon. The paper was a coroner's report. It was filed in February of 1881, dry bureaucratic language on 3 pages of territorial government stationery, and it described the deaths of 4 members of a family named Halverson, who had been found frozen in their barn 6 miles northwest of Eleanor's claim on the 14th of January. The barn had been a standard structure. 32 by 38 feet, cottonwood log construction, properly chinked roof in sound condition. The Halverson family had done everything right. They had brought their livestock inside before the storm hit. They had stored adequate firewood against the wall nearest the animals. They had stayed put when the blizzard arrived rather than attempting to travel, which was the single most common fatal mistake on the frontier, and the one that the Halverson family had the good sense to avoid. By every measure that any experienced frontier settler would have recognized, their barn represented adequate winter shelter. 4 people had died in it anyway. Eleanor read the report 3 times sitting at the library table in Yankton, and then she sat very still for a long moment, looking out the window at the summer street outside. A horse-drawn wagon rolled past. 2 women in light dresses walked on the boardwalk, laughing at something Eleanor couldn't hear through the glass. The world outside looked entirely safe, entirely ordinary, entirely unrelated to the document in her hands. She read the coroner's conclusion a 4th time. Cause of death: exposure. Contributing factors: prolonged extreme cold event duration, 71 hours, temperatures ranging from 31 to 44 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. Shelter assessed as adequate by frontier standards. Thermal retention insufficient to sustain survivable temperatures during multi-day extreme cold event of this magnitude. No evidence of negligence. The Halverson family took all reasonable precautions. Adequate shelter. Insufficient thermal retention. She set the paper down on the library table and looked at her own hands. Strong hands calloused from 4 years of homestead work, from breaking sod and hauling water and mending fence, and doing every physical task that a woman alone on a Dakota claim was required to do. Hands that had learned to figure things out because figuring things out was the only alternative to failing. She had a degree of formal education that most women in the territory didn't possess. Her father had insisted on it, an unusual Norwegian immigrant who believed with quiet stubbornness that a girl's mind was as worth developing as a boy's, and who had backed that belief with the time and money required to make it real. She had read agricultural journals and engineering texts and anything else she could obtain access to, partly from genuine intellectual appetite, and partly because information felt like the only armor that reliably mattered out here. On the Dakota frontier in the 1880s, what you didn't know could kill you in 100 different ways, and what you did know could keep you alive through conditions that broke people who relied on confidence alone. But she had never until this moment done the specific calculation that the Halverson deaths demanded. What temperature did a standard barn actually reach during a multi-day extreme cold event? Not the comfortable estimate that most settlers carried in their heads, the reassuring sense that livestock body heat and solid log walls would be enough, but the actual number. The real number. The number that held when the storm lasted not 1 night, but 3, when the wind drove the cold through every gap in the construction, when the thermal mass of the logs themselves had been chilled for 60 hours and were no longer retaining anything. She began working through it on the back of a library requisition slip. Average Dakota barn, 1,200 square feet of interior space, 20-foot ceiling at the peak. 6 adult cattle generating approximately 500 BTU per hour each. 2 draft horses at 600 BTU each. Cottonwood log walls with clay chinking an R value of perhaps 4 to 6 per inch of thickness in a 12-inch wall, which was generous by frontier standards. The math was not complicated. The math was in fact devastatingly simple. At 40 below 0 outside, with wind driving the cold through every gap and seam in the construction, a standard barn with average livestock could maintain an interior temperature of perhaps 15 to 20 degrees Fahrenheit. Maybe a few degrees warmer if the family huddled together in one corner and the animals clustered near them. Maybe a few degrees colder if the storm lasted long enough to chill the thermal mass of the logs themselves, which at 71 hours was exactly what would have happened to the Halverson barn. 15 degrees, perhaps 20, for 3 days. People died at those temperatures. They died slowly. The cold worked on the body with patience, pulling heat from the extremities first, then the core, then shutting down the systems that required heat to function, but they died. The Halverson family hadn't been careless or foolish. They had done everything that generations of frontier wisdom told them to do, and they had died anyway because the standard advice was built on assumptions that broke down at the extremes. At the ordinary extremes that this land produced every few years as a matter of course, as casually as it produced spring floods and summer drought, and the August heat that cracked the earth in long straight lines like wounds. Eleanor sat in that library for 3 more hours, working through her calculations and checking them against everything she knew from the agricultural engineering journals she had been reading for years. She thought about thermal mass and heat retention and the physics of insulation. She thought about the Earth itself, about the way the ground stayed at a constant 54 degrees year-round, once you got below the frost line, impervious to whatever the atmosphere was doing above it, storing heat with a patience and capacity that no manufactured material could match. She had read about Earth-Bermed construction in a Norwegian agricultural journal 2 years earlier. She had read about the Mandan earth lodges along the Missouri River structures that had kept their inhabitants warm through Dakota winters that had been killing European settlers for decades. She had understood the engineering principles involved with the part of her mind that was always working on problems, always filing information against the possibility of future use. Now she needed to act on that understanding, because the Halverson family had taken all reasonable precautions, and it hadn't been enough. And reasonable precautions built on flawed assumptions were not precautions at all. They were a comfortable story people told themselves until the story stopped being adequate. When she finally left the library, she carried 3 things. The first was a handwritten copy of the coroner's report, which she had obtained permission to transcribe. The second was 4 pages of calculations. The third was a conviction so complete it felt less like a decision than like a fact she had simply failed to notice until now. She was going to build something different, something that used the Earth itself as insulation and thermal battery. Something that worked not against the Dakota winter, but with the fundamental physics of the ground beneath her feet, which would hold its 54 degrees year-round regardless of what happened at the surface. Something that no storm, however brutal and sustained, could overcome, because the thermal mass of the surrounding Earth was not a wall that extreme cold could penetrate in 71 hours. It was ancient and vast, and it had been storing heat since before the first human beings set foot on this continent, and it would keep storing it regardless of what the atmosphere chose to do above it. She knew how to build it. She had known for 2 years in the abstract way, you know things you haven't yet needed to use. Now she needed to use it. She began in September of 1881. The work had to be secret. This was not a decision made from pride, and it was not made lightly. Eleanor Voss had learned in 4 years on the Dakota frontier that a woman alone occupied a particular social position, one that required constant management of other people's instinct to manage her. There were genuinely good people in her community who wanted the best for her, who felt that a widow of 2 years running a homestead claim alone was inherently in need of guidance and protection. She had navigated this with patience and a certain strategic economy with information about her plans. But what she was proposing to build was not something she could present vaguely. It was specific and unusual, and it would invite scrutiny she couldn't afford until the structure was complete, and she could speak from evidence rather than theory. More importantly, she wasn't entirely certain she was right. The math said she was right. The engineering principles said she was right. But math operated in the clean world of abstraction, and this was the Dakota Prairie in 1881, which operated in the world of mud and frozen ground and materials that behaved unpredictably, and human error compounded by exhaustion. She would build it, test it, and then when she was certain, she would show it and explain it and let other people judge the result rather than the intention. Every evening after fieldwork, she descended into the barn and excavated. 8 to 10 cubic feet per night, working by lantern light with a short-handled spade in the space she had marked along the northern wall. She carried the earth out in buckets 2 or 3 trips per session and scattered it across her property in places where it wouldn't accumulate into a visible pile, along the edges of the winter wheat field, into the low spots of the yard where the spring melt always left soft ground, behind the chicken coop where she'd been meaning to fill a drainage problem for 2 seasons. It was slow. It was brutal. There were nights she came in after midnight with her back burning and her hands so stiff she could barely hold a fork at the supper table. She ate it alone. There were nights she questioned whether she was using her limited resources, time, money, physical energy in the right way. There were nights she took the coroner's report out of her coat pocket and read the 4 names at the bottom of the final page, and then put it back and picked up her spade. Anders Halverson, Ingrid Halverson, Tobias Halverson, Clara Halverson. She knew their names. That was enough. By the end of October 1881, she had a rough chamber excavated 12 feet by 14 feet by 7 feet high, cut into the earth behind the barn's northern wall, with the existing log wall forming one side and 3 walls of packed Dakota clay forming the other 3. She had shored the ceiling with salvaged lumber from an abandoned claim 4 miles east. Lumber that the territory would never use again, hauled in 3 trips with her wagon under cover of early morning. In November, an old Norwegian carpenter named Ericson came through the county. He was perhaps 70, with enormous hands and a way of examining construction that went beyond technical assessment into something closer to conversation, as though he were asking the structure questions and listening carefully to its answers. He had spent 50 years building things in the hardest climates in the world, and he could read a structure the way most men read a face. She showed him what she was building. Not because she had planned to, it simply happened the way things happen when you are exhausted and the work is harder than you anticipated, and another human being with genuine knowledge appears at exactly the right moment. She showed him the rough chamber, and he walked around it for a long time without speaking, pressing his palm against the walls in different places, testing the ceiling joists, crouching to examine the floor with his lantern held close to the packed earth. Then he straightened up and looked at her. "The floor," he said. "You need stone. Flat stone fitted close, mortared with limestone and sand. The earth floor will absorb your heat in the wrong direction, down into the ground, away from the people who need it. Stone will absorb the heat and hold it at the level where you live, where your feet are, where the cold attacks first." He paused, looking at the walls with satisfaction. "Everything else you have done correctly. Better than correctly. This will work." Those were the most valuable words anyone said to Eleanor Voss during the entire 14 months of construction. She drove 3 miles to the creek twice to haul flat limestone from the streambed. She laid the floor exactly as Ericson had described, fitted and mortared each stone, placed with the care of someone who understood that what she was building now might someday be the difference between life and death. Ericson died in April of 1882 before the chamber was finished. He never saw what his instruction had helped create, and she never forgot what he had given her. Raymond Holt came in November of 1881, 3 weeks after she had begun excavating. He was 46 years old and had come to the Dakota frontier in 1873 after 9 years as a Union Army quartermaster, a role that had given him a way of thinking about logistics, supply, and shelter that was fundamentally different from how most civilians thought about those things. He had kept 3,000 soldiers functional through multiple winter campaigns in conditions that would have broken men without his particular brand of practical intelligence. He understood cold and shelter in ways that most people on the frontier didn't, and this understanding had made him genuinely effective on the claim he'd built over 9 years. It had also, in certain specific ways, made him resistant to approaches that didn't match the patterns he had learned to trust. He had heard from Harlon that Eleanor was doing something unusual with her barn. He came to look, and she showed him because the excavation was still rough and unfinished, and she found against her intention that she wanted another set of experienced eyes before she committed further. He walked around the space slowly with his arms crossed over his chest in the posture of a man conducting professional assessment. He tested the walls with the flat of his hand. He looked up at the ceiling joist with the focused attention of someone who has spent years thinking about structural load. He was quiet for a long time, and she let him be quiet because she recognized that his silence was working. Silence the kind that precedes a conclusion rather than an evasion. "I understand what you're trying to do," he said finally. "The thermal mass principle. I've read about it in the engineering literature." He paused. "In 1864, outside Petersburg, one of our engineering officers built a covered earth shelter for a forward observation unit. Earth-Bermed reinforced timber ceiling designed to hold warmth without fires that would reveal the position. Very clever construction. Exactly this kind of thinking." Another pause. 7 men died in it when the roof collapsed under 3 feet of overnight snow accumulation. We hadn't adequately accounted for dynamic snow load with wind-driven accumulation layered on top of static weight. He looked at her salvaged lumber ceiling. "How have you calculated your load capacity?" It was a fair question. It was the right question. She showed him her calculations, the span of the joists, the estimated dead load of the sod above the snow load figure she had used. He studied the numbers with the serious attention of a man who had once been responsible for other people's lives based on similar calculations, and she watched his face as he worked through what she had done. "Your math is sound as far as it goes," he said finally, "but your maximum snow load figure 22 pounds per square foot. In a severe storm with wind-driven accumulation piling against a leeward structure, you could see 35 pounds, possibly 40. He handed back her papers. "That's where the margin disappears. That's exactly where my men died." He left without telling her to stop. He left, she understood, because he had said what he came to say, and the rest was her decision. He was a man who respected decisions, even ones he doubted once they had been heard out. She stood in the cold interior of the unfinished chamber after he left and looked at the ceiling joists for a long time. Then she spent the next 3 weeks reinforcing every joint, adding support columns she hadn't planned to include, redesigning the connection points between joists and the exterior wall to distribute load rather than concentrate it. When she was finished, the ceiling of her chamber could hold 50 pounds per square foot, without any single element approaching its failure threshold. Raymond Holt had come to stop her. He had instead given her the ceiling that would save 17 lives. She filed this as data and kept digging. Britta Pulk arrived in December of 1881. She was 51 years old, a Polish immigrant who had come to Dakota Territory in 1877 after years in Europe that had shaped her understanding of cold and confinement in ways that no textbook could replicate. She was a broad-shouldered woman with iron-gray hair and a face that had stopped performing emotions for other people's benefit somewhere in her 40s, a face that said exactly what it meant and expected the same in return. Some people found this quality cold. Eleanor Voss found it one of the most refreshing things about her. She walked around the chamber with her hands clasped behind her back the way she walked around everything, and she tested the limestone floor with her boot heel, and she looked at the ventilation ports. The 2 small openings Eleanor had placed in the upper corners of the east and west walls, with the careful, focused attention of a woman who knew precisely what she was evaluating. In old country, Britta said spaces like this, underground, low-ceiling, sod walls, I know what happens in them. She looked at Eleanor directly. Not the cold, the air. When fire burns too long in a closed space, the air goes wrong. People sleep and don't wake up. She touched one of the ventilation ports with 2 fingers, testing its dimensions. These, are they enough? It was the question Eleanor had asked herself repeatedly and answered with calculations she believed were correct. But belief was not certainty, and certainty was what you needed when the alternative was people dying in their sleep while you kept them warm. Tell me what you know about it, Eleanor said. Britta looked at her with an expression that shifted slightly, the particular surprise of a person who expects to be thanked for their concern and dismissed, and instead finds their knowledge being actively solicited. Then she talked for 40 minutes about air quality in enclosed spaces and the invisible dynamics of combustion competing with respiration for the same finite resource. About the signs of oxygen depletion, the headache that comes first, then the heaviness, then the sleep that looks peaceful because the person experiencing it is past the point of discomfort. About the rate at which a small fire in an enclosed space consumed what lungs required and what the margin looked like at different burn rates and different occupancy levels. Eleanor listened to every word and wrote down what mattered. That week she added a candle test system she had read about in an engineering journal, but hadn't originally planned to implement test points at 3 locations in the chamber, positioned to detect airflow from the ventilation ports. If a candle flame at any of those points stood perfectly still, not leaning, not flickering toward the vent, it indicated ventilation was compromised. Simple, reliable, requiring nothing more sophisticated than a candle and the knowledge of what a properly functioning system looked like. She also enlarged both ventilation ports by 30%. Britta Pulk had come to warn her. She had instead given Eleanor the ventilation system that would keep 17 people breathing through the longest night of the storm. Eleanor filed this too as data. She was beginning to understand something about the nature of disagreement that she hadn't fully articulated before, that people who pushed back hardest were often people who had learned the hardest lessons. Their objections weren't obstacles to work around. They were experience dressed in the clothes of doubt, waiting to be recognized for what it actually was. Caleb Marsh came in January of 1882. He was 27 years old and had been born on the Dakota frontier, not come to it as an adult with Eastern habits and Eastern assumptions that had to be slowly unlearned, but born into it, grown up in it, shaped from his first breath by a landscape that had no patience for misunderstanding. He worked as a ranch hand on the Greer spread 12 miles south, and he stopped by Eleanor's claim every few weeks in a way that was friendly, and also she suspected carried a slight protectiveness, the instinct of a younger person who respected an older woman's competence but worried about her solitude in a place where solitude could turn dangerous without much notice. She showed him the chamber because she was tired of carrying the secret alone, and because she trusted his practical judgment more than almost anyone else's, and because she wanted someone who had spent his entire life on this specific frontier to look at what she had built and tell her honestly what they saw. He was quiet for a long time. He examined the ceiling joists and the ventilation ports, and the stove connection in the limestone floor. He read her thermal calculations without comment. He sat down on the floor with his back against the sod wall and thought, and she let him think because she had learned that Caleb Marsh's silences were where his best thinking happened. "It's well built," he said at last. "The craftsmanship is solid, better than solid." He looked at the ceiling, the doubled support columns, the reinforced joint connections that bore no resemblance to anything she'd shown Raymond Holt 2 months earlier. "But here's what concerns me. Everything you've built here functions as a single integrated system. The thermal mass, the stove, the ventilation, the provisions. If any one element fails during a 3-day blizzard at 40 below, what is your recovery plan?" She didn't have an immediate answer. "Your regular barn," he continued. "If something fails, you can see it failing. A wall starts to go, you address it. A window gives way, you board it. The failure is visible and recoverable in real time. But this chamber, if something goes wrong here, in the middle of a multi-day storm at survivable minus temperatures, you find out at the worst possible moment with no time to adapt and no margin for error." He looked at her steadily. "You've built something you can't test until the moment of testing is also the moment of catastrophe. That's not a criticism of the engineering. It's a structural truth about what this is." He said it without condescension, without dismissal, with the genuine care of a young man who respected what she was doing and was pointing out the one thing she couldn't fix by reinforcing the ceiling joints. She had no answer that night. She sat in the chamber alone after he left the lantern burning low, the thermometer reading 54 degrees, the limestone floor faintly warm beneath her. She sat for 3 hours, turning his words over, looking for the flaw in his reasoning, because if there was a flaw, she needed to find it. And if there wasn't a flaw, she needed to sit with that truth until she understood what it actually meant for everything she was doing. There was no flaw. He was right. You couldn't test this until failure meant death. That was the nature of the thing she was building. Preparation for a scenario that, if it never arrived, would make the preparation look like waste, and if it arrived and failed, would make the preparation look like arrogance. She took the coroner's report out of her coat pocket. Anders Halverson, age 41. Ingrid Halverson, age 38. Tobias Halverson, age 14. Clara Halverson, age 9. She read the names. She had been reading them since September. She had kept the paper in her coat pocket specifically for moments like this. Moments when the doubt became heavier than the certainty, and she needed to remember what the certainty was built on. 4 people who had done everything right. 4 people who had died in a barn that met every standard anyone in the territory would have called adequate. 4 people whose deaths had been recorded in 3 pages of bureaucratic language and filed in a territorial office, and would have been forgotten entirely unremarkable among the season's losses if Eleanor Voss hadn't gone to the Yankton Library on a Tuesday afternoon in September and found them. She put the report back in her pocket. She went back to work. The chamber was complete by October of 1882, 12 feet by 14 feet by 7 feet high. 3-foot thick walls of packed sod on the 3 sides not backed by the barn's existing northern log wall. Limestone floor fitted and mortared, each stone placed with care. A small sheet iron stove with a flue that ran up through the main barn and vented through the existing chimney, invisible from any external viewpoint. 2 ventilation ports in the upper corners of the east and west walls, fitted with adjustable covers. 3 candle test points built into the walls at the positions Britta's knowledge had specified. A heavy plank door flush with the hay bale facade that could be secured from inside with a timber bar. The total cost of materials she couldn't scavenge or salvage, $39.50. Nearly a third of her operating reserve. She had spent 1 winter's food supply on a room she hoped she would never need. She stood in the finished chamber on a cold October evening with her lantern and thermometer and looked at what 14 months of solitary work had produced. The thermometer read 56 degrees Fahrenheit. The stove was unlit. Outside the barn, the temperature was 31 degrees and falling. She checked the ventilation ports. She checked the candle test points. She loaded the stove, once let it burn for 2 hours, and watched the thermometer climb to 68 degrees, while the limestone floor absorbed heat and the sod walls held every degree inside. Then she let it burn down and watched the temperature hold, not plummeting, the way a conventionally heated room plummeted when the fire died, but declining slowly, reluctantly, the thermal mass of the surrounding earth releasing back what it had absorbed, sustaining the warmth long after the source of that warmth had gone cold. The math was right. The structure worked exactly as she had calculated. One winter passed without the chamber being needed. Eleanor maintained it monthly provisions, fuel supply, stove ventilation system, candle test points, structural integrity of the ceiling. She checked everything with the methodical attention of someone who had built a system that could not be tested under actual conditions and had decided that eliminating every other variable was the nearest available substitute. She began in the long, quiet evenings of that first winter to wonder if Caleb had been right in the way he hadn't intended, not that the chamber was dangerous, but that it was unnecessary. That she had spent $39.50 and 14 months of evenings on a structure that the Dakota winter might never force her to use. She kept maintaining it anyway because the Halverson family had also spent time and money and effort on a barn that had failed them at the worst possible moment. And the difference between adequate and sufficient was measured in lives on a frontier where the nearest doctor was 73 miles away, and the land had been killing people since before anyone alive could remember. On the morning of the 3rd of November, 1882, Harlon Gaines rode across her property line with the barometer reading and the Widowmaker sky behind him, and Eleanor Voss stood in her farmyard and looked at the northwestern horizon and understood that the future had made its choice. She was ready. She walked into the barn. She checked the chamber one final time. Provisions, ventilation, stove, flue connection, candle test points. Everything in order. Temperature inside 56 degrees stove, unlit outside temperature 12 below and falling. She closed the chamber door and positioned the hay bales and harnesses back in front of it, concealing the entrance with the practiced ease of someone who had performed this particular arrangement many times. Then she went about the work of bringing her livestock inside and securing the barn against what was coming. The wind hit at 2 o'clock that afternoon. Not the ordinary howl of a Dakota gale, but something that sounded like an avalanche, a sustained geological roar that came from the northwest and hit the barn like a physical object, like something with mass and intention. The temperature outside was dropping at a rate she had not seen in 4 years on this claim. The sky had gone the color of iron and stayed there. She was in the chamber stove, lit now, room temperature climbing towards 66 degrees when she heard the pounding on the barn door. Not debris, not the random percussion of wind-driven objects against wood. The deliberate, desperate rhythm of a human fist. She moved through the barn and hauled the door open against the wind, leaning her full weight into it to keep it from slamming against the wall, and 3 figures collapsed through the gap in an explosion of snow and cold and gasping breath. Britta Pulk. Her daughter Vera, 6 months along and shaking so hard her teeth audibly chattered. And Oscar, Britta's 9-year-old grandson, ice crystals on his eyelashes, his small face the color of old wax. "Our house," Britta said. Her voice was stripped to essentials by cold and effort. "Roof gave way under the snow. We ran for your place." She looked at Eleanor with eyes that had seen considerable difficulty in 51 years and were currently encountering more. Raymond Holt, his chimney collapsed, filled the house with smoke. His boy is running to warn others. There are more people coming. A pause in which something shifted behind Britta Polk's eyes, a recalculation, a reckoning with something she had been refusing to reckon with until this moment. "Eleanor, this storm, this is the killing kind. This is the temperature outside was 23 below zero, and the sun had not yet set." Eleanor looked at the 3 people in front of her, Britta, who had helped her build a better ventilation system without knowing it. Vera, whose unborn child needed warmth more urgently than almost anything else in Dakota Territory at this specific moment. Oscar, whose small body was losing heat at a rate that would become dangerous within the hour. "I have something to show you," she said. The look on Britta Polk's face when Eleanor pulled the hay bales aside was something that would stay with her for a long time. It wasn't simple surprise. It was the more complex expression of a person whose fixed understanding of a situation has suddenly proven insufficient, a rapid internal revision happening in real time, visible at the surface. Britta Polk had survived the Prussian winter of 1870. She had crossed the Atlantic in February. She had homesteaded on the Dakota frontier since 1877. She was not a woman who was easily undone by the unexpected. But she stood in the entrance of the hidden chamber and looked at the limestone floor radiating steady warmth, at the sod walls 3 feet thick on 3 sides, at the small stove already burning clean and steady, at the shelves of organized provisions, at the thermometer on the eastern wall, reading 66 degrees Fahrenheit, and something in her face went very quiet. Outside, the temperature was 23 below zero and falling. Eleanor watched Britta's eyes move through the space, taking inventory, calculating, understanding what she was seeing with the speed of a woman who had spent 30 years developing practical intelligence about cold and shelter and survival. She looked at the candles positioned at the ventilation test points, their flames bent in a gentle, steady lean toward the ports, exactly the behavior Eleanor had designed for exactly what Britta's own knowledge about enclosed spaces and air quality had helped create. Britta stared at those candles for a long moment. Then she turned to Eleanor, and her voice when she spoke was very quiet. "You built this," she said. "Yes. All of this, alone, in secret." "Yes. After I told you it was wrong?" "After you told me the ventilation wasn't sufficient," Eleanor said. "You were right about that. I fixed it." Something shifted in Britta's face, then a recognition of something she hadn't anticipated, a realization that her opposition had not been ignored, but incorporated, that the very system she was now depending on to keep her daughter and grandson alive had been improved because of what she had said. She looked at the candle flames leaning toward the ventilation ports, and she understood in that moment exactly what she was looking at. She had known the storm was coming. Eleanor could see it in the particular way Britta moved through the chamber entrance, not with the disorientation of someone encountering an entirely unexpected situation, but with the careful attention of a person who has had time to imagine a place and is now comparing the reality to what she anticipated. Britta Pulk's joints had been predicting weather accurately for 30 years. She had felt this storm building 2 days ago in her knees and her wrists in the particular ache that preceded the worst systems. She had known, and she had chosen not to come, not because she doubted the storm, but because coming here would have meant acknowledging that Eleanor had built something worth coming to. And then her roof had collapsed, and the choice had been made for her, and she was standing in the chamber she had argued against, in the warmth she had said was misplaced, and she was not saying anything at all. "Matko Boska," she said finally. 2 words in Polish that carried the weight of a complete recalculation. Then simply, "Get the child to the floor. The stone holds the heat." She had understood the physics in approximately 4 seconds. Eleanor felt a sudden complicated warmth for this woman, not the warmth of vindication, which was a smaller and colder thing than it was often assumed to be, but the warmth of genuine recognition. Of 2 people who thought carefully about hard problems, finding each other in the middle of one. She was already moving. She pulled blankets from the shelves and spread them on the limestone floor near the stove. Oscar, 9 years old and rigid with cold, allowed himself to be lowered onto the blankets without protest. Children that age protested everything. A child who didn't protest was a child whose body had prioritized survival over social performance, and that required immediate attention. She checked his hands and feet, whitening at the fingertips, not yet true frostbite, but close enough to require care. She wrapped him in 2 blankets and positioned him within 6 feet of the stove, close enough for radiant heat to reach him far enough from the surface to avoid the driest, hottest zone closest to the iron. Vera settled onto the blankets with the careful deliberateness of a woman whose body had learned to negotiate space differently over the past 6 months. Eleanor handed her a tin cup of warm water she had set on the stove surface the moment she lit it, thinking ahead in the way she had been thinking ahead for 14 months. "Small sips," Eleanor said. "Steady." Vera drank without argument. Her hands shook with cold rather than weakness. That was a good sign. Shaking meant the body was still fighting. The chamber door was open to the main barn, and through it Eleanor could hear the storm systematically testing every weakness in the construction. A high, sustained shriek had appeared in the general roar, the wind finding some gap or seam in the barn's fabric and exploiting it. The temperature in the main barn was already well below 0 and dropping. She had perhaps 40 minutes before more people arrived if they were coming. She stood at the chamber entrance and thought through logistics with the methodical attention she brought to every problem that was solvable by thinking. Capacity, provisions, fuel, medical supplies. She ran the numbers quickly and revised her estimates upward for each category, because Britta had said more people were coming, and Britta did not say things she wasn't certain of. She would deal with however many people arrived. That was the only answer that mattered. The barn door opened again and the storm came in with Raymond Holt. He came with his wife Ellen and their 3 children, ages 7, 11, and 14, and his grandmother Nora, who was 76 years old and had been managing a chest infection for 3 weeks that had now become something considerably more serious. Nora Holt moved with the shallow, careful breathing of a woman whose lungs were not performing at capacity and her skin had the grayish undertone that Eleanor associated with fever working on a body that had already been taxed. Behind Raymond came Harlon Gaines with his two teenage sons. Both boys had the red-white patches on their cheeks and ears that indicated early-stage frostbite from the mile-and-a-half journey across open prairie in what had become a full-ground blizzard. Harlon himself looked composed in the way of a man who has been genuinely frightened and has decided that the most useful response to that fear is methodical action. Eleanor counted 12 people in the barn, including herself. The door had not yet closed when she heard Caleb Marsh's voice outside shouting something against the wind. She pushed back through the gathered bodies and hauled the door open a second time. Caleb came through the gap, moving sideways, one arm around the shoulders of a man she didn't recognize. Broad-shouldered, perhaps 50, wearing a coat entirely inadequate for the current conditions. Behind Caleb came a woman and 3 children ranging from perhaps 6 to perhaps 16, all of them dressed in the manner of people caught by the storm rather than prepared for it. New to the territory. Eleanor read this immediately from their clothing, from the bewildered quality of their movements, from the way they clustered together without the instinctive spatial economy that frontier experience taught. Caleb got the door closed behind him and stood for a moment with his back against it, breathing hard. He had ice in his beard and frostbite beginning on his left cheek. He had clearly been in the open for considerably longer than the journey from any nearby homestead would require. "Found them on the road between Yankton and their new claim," he said, meeting Eleanor's eyes across the crowded barn. The man she didn't know, the Ericson father, she would learn his name was Gunnar. A Swedish immigrant, 3 months in the territory, stood supported against the barn wall with his family pressing against him. They'd been out there for over an hour. A pause. "This is everyone I know of." He did not say what he'd done to find them. He did not explain the extra time his detour had required or the risk he'd taken in the worsening storm. He said it the way a man says a fact that is complete in itself and requires no embellishment. 17 people. In Eleanor's barn in a storm that had already dropped the outside temperature to 31 below zero and showed no intention of moderating. She took one breath. She had planned for 6. She would work with 17. "Everyone follow me," she said. Her voice came out clear and level, the voice of a woman who had made her decision 14 months ago and was now executing it. "There's a room. It's warm. Come now." She would remember the next 20 minutes with the particular sharpness that belongs to moments when everything important is happening at once, and the mind processes it with absolute fidelity because there is no room for anything except the immediate task. She moved the most vulnerable first. Nora Holt, whose breathing concerned her most. Vera Pulk and her unborn child. The youngest children. Then the women. Then the men last because they were the most physically capable of tolerating the additional minutes in the barn's interior cold. The chamber designed for 6 absorbed 17 human beings with a compression that redefined the concept of crowded. Bodies arranged on the limestone floor in configurations that had nothing to do with comfort and everything to do with the simple arithmetic of 17 people in 168 square feet. Eleanor's shelving unit along the eastern wall was partially dismantled, provisions moved to the floor, stacked in whatever arrangement allowed the maximum number of people to sit. Blankets distributed to those who needed them most. Children positioned closest to the stove where the radiant heat was most immediate. The stove, burning hard, now pulled the chamber temperature upward. 68 degrees. 70. The thermal mass of the limestone floor and the surrounding earth, which had been absorbing the stove's output for the 2 hours since she'd lit it on Harlan's warning, was now releasing that stored heat back into the room from every direction simultaneously. The effect was different from a conventionally heated space. The warmth came from below and from 3 sides, wrapping around the room's occupants the way the earth itself wrapped around the chamber. Children's shuddering subsided into ordinary breathing, the rigid tension of extreme cold releasing from shoulders and jaws and hands. Nora Holt's shallow, rapid breathing slowed marginally as the warmth reached her. The gray undertone in her skin remained, but the frantic quality of her respiration eased. Eleanor lit 3 candles and positioned them at the ventilation test points built into the chamber walls. She watched the flames. They bent in a gentle, steady lean toward the ventilation ports, exactly right. Not drafty, not stagnant. Moving at the rate she had calculated, renewed at the rate 17 breathing human beings required. Britta Pulk, sitting on the floor with Oscar's head in her lap, was watching the candles. She caught Eleanor's eye and gave one slow, deliberate nod. She understood the system completely. She had helped build it. Outside, the storm had become something beyond ordinary weather. The barn walls shuddered with impacts that felt structural. The wind had found its high register and was holding it sustained and relentless without the variation of ordinary gales, as though it had decided on this particular note and intended to hold it until something gave way. Eleanor checked the thermometer at the chamber entrance, the one positioned to read the main barn's temperature. 4 degrees below zero. She checked again an hour later. 7 below. The barn was cooling at 2 degrees per hour. She did the math automatically the way she always did math, not as effort but as reflex, because it lived in her mind the way her own name did. At 7 below and falling with 3 cows and 2 draft horses in the open barn, the livestock would lose their ability to generate sufficient heat to survive in approximately 11 to 14 hours. She made a note of this and set it aside. The livestock were a loss she had calculated for. The people were not. It was Raymond Holt who first spoke to her directly about what he was seeing. He had positioned himself near his grandmother Nora, with his back against the warm sod wall, long legs folded to take minimum space, and he watched Eleanor work with the steady calibrating attention of a man who had spent 9 years as a quartermaster and understood logistics in the same way most people understood breathing automatically constantly without having to think about the fact that he was doing it. He watched her add fuel to the stove in measured quantities, not the generous loading of a person wanting a large fire, but the calibrated additions of a person managing a burn rate against a finite supply over an unknown but estimable duration. He watched her check the flue connection where the small iron pipe passed through the chamber ceiling. He watched her move through the crowded space, checking on people with the systematic thoroughness of someone working through a mental checklist. "You thought through the fuel supply," he said when she passed close enough for quiet conversation. 12 days at maximum consumption for one person, she said. "For this many, I'll revise that estimate, but we have adequate margin." He was quiet for a moment, then lower. "I started building one of these, after I came to see yours last November." She looked at him. "Got about 3 weeks in," he said. His voice was level, the voice of a man giving an honest account of something he wasn't proud of. "Then I stopped. I told myself the calculations were probably flawed somewhere. That building something this unconventional on the basis of one woman's arithmetic was reckless." He looked at the limestone floor, at the sod walls, at the candle flames leaning faithfully toward the ventilation ports. "What I was actually doing was not trusting myself to execute the design correctly, and deciding that if I couldn't trust myself, the whole enterprise was suspect." A pause. "I have been running that calculation backward in my head for the last hour. If I had finished what I started, my family would not have needed to run across open ground in a ground blizzard with my grandmother barely able to breathe." Eleanor had no answer that would serve him. There was nothing to say that didn't diminish something true, either his admission or her own understanding of what the winter had cost him. She said, "Nora's color is better than when you arrived. The warmth is helping." Raymond nodded. He pressed 2 fingers against his grandmother's wrist, reading her pulse, and whatever he found there seemed to ease him slightly. "The willow bark tea," he said. "Is that in your supplies?" "Second shelf. I'll prepare it." She prepared it and brought it to Nora in the tin cup she kept on the stove's surface, and the smell of it joined the other smells of the chamber wood smoke and wool blankets and the faint ancient earthen warmth of the sod walls, which smelled, she had always thought, like the prairie itself. Like something that had been here a very long time and intended to continue. 17 people, 11 adults and 6 children, 1 elderly woman with a serious chest infection and a fever that the willow bark would address but not cure. 1 pregnant woman at 6 months who needed warmth and rest above all else. 2 of Harlon's boys with early frostbite on their faces and hands. 3 of the Ericson children who had moved past the first shock of rescue into the emotional honesty of children who no longer needed to hold themselves together. Which meant Oscar Pulk was quietly crying into his grandmother's side, and the 2 younger Ericson children were pressed against their mother with the particular posture of children who need to be held and are slightly ashamed of needing it. Gunnar Ericson, the father, sat against the eastern wall with his large hands on his knees and watched everything with the careful, helpless attention of a man who understands that the situation is entirely beyond his control and is finding that understanding nearly unbearable. His wife, a pale, composed woman who had introduced herself simply as Marta before stopping talking and beginning the more urgent work of keeping her children warm, had positioned herself between Gunnar and the children in a way that was both protective and stabilizing, as though she was holding her family together by physical proximity alone. Eleanor dealt with all of it, Not gracefully, there was no grace in 17 people in a 12 by 14-foot room, but competently moving through the space, as though she had rehearsed this scenario, which in a certain sense she had because she had walked through it in her mind so many times over 14 months, that the actual execution of it felt like the completion of something long begun, rather than improvisation under pressure. The crisis came at the 19th hour. She was monitoring the candles at the eastern ventilation port when she noticed the flame behavior change. The gentle, steady lean toward the port, the lean that indicated proper airflow, had flattened. The flame stood nearly vertical, its tip barely moving. She crossed to the western port immediately. Same behavior. She looked at the stove, burning properly. She checked the flue connection at the chamber ceiling where the small iron pipe met the barn's main chimney system. The connection was intact. She pressed her palm against the pipe at different heights, feeling for temperature variation that would indicate a blockage upstream. She found it. The pipe was cooler than it should be at a point approximately 4 feet above the chamber ceiling, the section running through the barn's open interior before connecting to the main chimney. Snow accumulation on the barn roof had compressed the chimney stack, partially collapsing the draw. Not enough to stop the fire, but enough to reduce the ventilation rate to a level that, with 17 people breathing in the enclosed space, would become dangerous within 2 to 3 hours. Not immediately, gradually. The way carbon monoxide worked, giving you headache and heaviness and sleep before you understood what was happening. She thought through the solutions in approximately 30 seconds. Going onto the roof in current conditions, wind at an estimated 60 miles an hour, temperature around 35 below, was not survivable. That option did not exist. Working from inside the barn to clear the obstruction was possible. She had built an access panel into the flue system specifically because Caleb Marsh's question about failure modes had stayed with her, and she had decided that if she could not test the system before she needed it, she could at least design it with accessible repair points. The panel was a removable iron plate 6 inches by 8 inches, held by 2 bolts positioned in the section of flue that ran through the barn interior. She had a length of iron rod stored specifically for this purpose in the chamber alcove. She explained the situation to Caleb in 4 sentences. He had the panel bolts off in 3 minutes. They worked together with the iron rod inserted through the access panel and worked upward through the flue, breaking up the compressed snow and ice that had reduced the draw. The barn was 9 degrees below zero, and their breath made clouds that the dead air barely dispersed. It took 11 minutes. Caleb worked with the focused economical physicality of someone who grew up doing hard things in difficult conditions, and Eleanor directed with the precision of someone who had designed the access point they were currently using and knew exactly what the obstruction required. When the draw cleared, she heard it before she measured it. The sound of the fire changed, deepened slightly, became more purposeful. She crossed to the chamber and checked the candles. The flame at the eastern port leaned steadily toward the vent. The western port followed a moment later. She looked at Caleb, who had followed her back into the chamber. He looked at the candles. He looked at her. "You designed an access panel," he said. "Yes, because you thought the flue might block. I thought it was a possible failure mode, blocking from external snow accumulation on the chimney stack." He was quiet for a moment. "You built a repair point into the system before you knew if you'd ever need to repair it." "I built repair points for every failure mode I could identify," she said. Flue obstruction was one of them. Something changed in his expression. Not the dramatic shift of sudden conversion, but the quieter, more durable change of a person revising a considered position in the light of specific evidence. A recalibration. The kind that sticks because it's earned rather than given. Raymond Holt had watched the entire operation from the chamber doorway. He said nothing. But when Eleanor came back in and crossed to the stove to add fuel, she felt his eyes on her in a way that was different from before. The assessing attention had been replaced by something more settled. Something that looked, she thought, like a man who has revised an important calculation and accepted the new number. She did her head count. 17. All present. The first night was the longest. Eleanor kept watch alone from midnight to 4 in the morning, the hours when the storm reached what she judged to be its peak intensity. The wind had found its highest register and was holding it, not gusting, not varying, but maintaining a sustained roar that had no interval of lesser noise in which to rest or gather strength. The barn shuddered continuously. The high shrieking note in the construction held. She fed the stove and measured quantities, checked the candles, moved quietly through the sleeping bodies on her limestone floor, and counted faces in the lantern light. Britta with Oscar against her. Raymond sitting upright with Nora's head against his shoulder, unwilling to sleep while his grandmother's breathing was still labored. Harlan's boys, their frost-bitten faces beginning the painful red bloom of circulation returning. The Ericson children in a row against the southern wall pressed together for warmth and comfort in the way of children who have learned that proximity is its own kind of safety. She thought about the Halverson family. She thought about the $39.50 and the 14 months. She thought about Raymond Holt's reinforced ceiling, holding against whatever snow load was accumulating on the barn roof above them, and she knew from the sound and from her calculation of the storm's intensity that the load was approaching the upper range of what she had designed for. She thought about Britta Pulk's ventilation knowledge keeping 17 people breathing in a space designed for 6. She thought about Caleb Marsh's question giving her the access panel they had needed 3 hours ago. She thought about how the thing she had built had been shaped by the people who had opposed it. How opposition received correctly was not an obstacle, but a tool. How the 3 people who had tried to talk her out of the chamber had each given her something she hadn't known she needed, and the chamber was better for every one of their objections, and 17 people were alive because she had listened to the knowledge underneath the doubt. Outside, at approximately 2:30 in the morning, the temperature reached its lowest point. She didn't know the exact number until Harlan's pocket thermometer was retrieved and read 42 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. The lowest temperature recorded in their county in 30 years. In the chamber, the thermometer read 71 degrees. From the main barn, she heard the sound she had been expecting and dreading, a heavy final sound, and then silence, and then again. The cattle. She did not go to look. There was nothing to do for them, and she would not leave these 17 people to step over what she already knew was there. The livestock had been a calculated sacrifice from the moment she understood the storm's severity. She had chosen people over cattle without hesitation, and she would make that choice again. At 4 in the morning, she woke Raymond Holt for the next watch. He came awake completely and immediately in the way of a man who had learned to sleep without disappearing entirely. He looked at her and at the room and at the candles. "All well?" he asked quietly. "All well," she said. He took her place by the stove, and she lay down in the space she had reserved for herself, the smallest space against the coolest wall, because she had planned for 6 and accommodated 17 and taken what remained, and she was asleep in 4 minutes. Outside at 42 below, the Dakota prairie was silent under its drifts. Inside the chamber, 17 people breathed in the warmth the earth was holding for them, and the stove burned with the steady reliability of something correctly designed, and the candle flames leaned toward the ventilation ports in their quiet, faithful way, and the limestone floor gave back the heat it had stored through the long hours since Eleanor lit the stove and sat alone in the chamber for the last time, not knowing who would fill it or whether it would be enough. The second day came pale and brutal thin gray light, finding the gaps in the barn's construction and making them visible. The storm had not broken. The wind was still building drifts against the leeward wall. The temperature outside had risen from its overnight low to something that Harlan's thermometer retrieved from his coat and read with cold fingers reported as 31 degrees below 0. They were halfway through. Eleanor knew this before anyone else in the chamber because she had done the math. She had always done the math. She had built her life on this prairie on the conviction that numbers correctly assembled told a more reliable truth than intuition, more reliable than tradition, more reliable even than experience. Because experience was what the past had taught you, and the past had taught the Halverson family that an adequate barn was sufficient and they were dead. Numbers didn't care about what you had always done. Numbers only cared about what was actually true. She added fuel to the stove, checked the candles, and began preparing the morning's provisions. The second day in the chamber had a different quality than the first. The first day had been pure emergency, the physical work of survival compressed into its most essential components. There had been no space in it for anything except the immediate task of keeping 17 people alive in a space designed for 6, and that narrowness of focus had been in its own way a mercy. When the only question is the next hour, you don't have to think about anything larger than the next hour. The second day opened up. The storm had not broken. The wind was still building drifts against the barn's eastern wall, and the temperature outside had settled into the low 30s below 0 brutal, and sustained the kind of cold the Dakota frontier produced every several years as a reminder of what the land was capable of when it chose to stop tolerating human presence. But inside the chamber, the crisis had shifted from acute to chronic. The immediate danger of freezing to death had been replaced by the slower, more complex challenge of 17 people sharing a small warm space with finite provisions and no clear knowledge of how much longer they needed to hold. Eleanor told them at first light what the math said. She stood near the stove and explained the situation directly. The storm appeared to be tracking consistently with the pressure patterns Harlon had described, suggesting a total duration of between 36 and 50 hours. They were at approximately 22 hours. The provisions were adequate for twice the expected duration. The fuel supply was adequate. The ventilation was functioning correctly. The chamber temperature had not dropped below 67 degrees at any point during the night. She gave them numbers because she believed people deserved to know the truth of their situation, and because she had found in 4 years on the frontier that uncertainty was more corrosive than difficult facts. Difficult facts could be endured. Uncertainty was the thing that made people do desperate, irreversible things at the worst possible moments. No one argued with the numbers. No one panicked. They absorbed the information with the steadiness of people who have survived the worst moment of a crisis and understand instinctively that what remains requires patience rather than heroism. Raymond Holt was awake when Eleanor finished sitting against the south wall with Nora's head resting against his shoulder. The old woman was sleeping a better sleep than the restless, difficult hours she'd endured through her worst fever period, which had broken sometime before dawn. Her breathing was still labored, still the careful, shallow respiration of damaged lungs, but the frantic quality was gone. The willow bark tea and the warmth had done their work, and 76 years of stubborn existence on the Dakota frontier had apparently contributed its own share because Nora Holt was still alive in a storm that had frozen cattle in their stalls. Raymond watched Eleanor check the candles and add fuel to the stove and move through the provisions, count she performed with the unhurried precision of someone who had planned for exactly this scenario. He watched her with the calibrating attention he had been bringing to the situation since the afternoon before. "The access panel," he said when she passed close enough. "In the Flue. When did you plan that?" "January," Eleanor said. "After Caleb told me I couldn't test the system until failure meant death. I couldn't change that constraint, but I could reduce its consequences. Building in repair points was the nearest I could get to a solution." Raymond was quiet for a moment, working something through. "So his objection made the design better." "All three of your objections made the design better." She said it simply without emphasis. "Your concern about snow load gave me the ceiling that held last night. Britta's knowledge about air quality gave me the ventilation system that kept everyone breathing. Caleb's concern about failure modes gave me the access panel that let us fix the Flue without going onto the roof in 40 below wind." She added a measured piece of cottonwood to the stove. "I thought I was keeping this secret because I needed to prove it worked before I could defend it. But I think what I was actually doing was giving myself time to incorporate what other people knew into what I had calculated. The secrecy protected that process." Raymond looked at the ceiling, the reinforced joists, the doubled support columns, the carefully distributed load connections that he recognized as his own concern translated into structure. "I came to talk you out of something reckless," he said. "I didn't think of myself as a contributor to the thing I was arguing against." "Most useful contributors don't," Eleanor said and moved on. Caleb Marsh had spent the night near the chamber door in the marginal coolness of the space farthest from the stove without complaint, and apparently without discomfort, in the manner of a man who had spent his entire 27 years sleeping in conditions most people would have considered inhospitable. He was awake now, sitting cross-legged on the limestone floor, with the upright stillness of someone who had learned to inhabit his own body without fidgeting, watching the room with the quiet attentiveness Eleanor had noticed in him from their first conversation. She sat near him when the morning's tasks allowed it. The storm's continuous roar provided a kind of acoustic privacy, absorbing quiet voices and returning them to the speakers alone. "How are the Ericsons?" she asked, nodding toward Gunnar and his family clustered near the center of the room. "Better than last night," Caleb said. "The youngest slept several hours. That's a good sign." He paused. "Gunnar asked me this morning through what I could piece together of his Swedish and my best guesses whether the woman who built this room was some kind of engineer." Eleanor looked at him. "I told him I thought that was approximately correct," Caleb said. He seemed relieved by the description. She almost smiled. "What did you tell him about the room?" "The truth. That you spent 14 months building it alone, that 3 people told you it was unnecessary, and that last night it held 17 people at 70 degrees while the temperature outside was 42 below." He looked at the sod walls, the limestone floor, the stove that had been burning for more than 20 hours with steady reliability. I left out the part where I was one of the three. You weren't wrong, Eleanor said. You told me I couldn't test it until failure meant death. That was true. I simply had to decide whether that constraint was a reason not to build or a reason to build more carefully. Caleb turned to look at her. Did you ever almost stop? The question landed in one of those intervals between gusts where the sound level dropped briefly and a quiet voice carried clearly. Eleanor had been expecting the question in the abstract way you expect things that have been building toward expression for a long time. She was quiet for a moment, not because she didn't know the answer, but because she wanted to give him the true one rather than the manageable one. The night after you came, she said, January of 1882. I sat in here alone for 3 hours after you left. The stove was lit. The thermometer read 54 degrees. Everything was working exactly as I'd calculated it. She looked at the eastern wall, and I sat there thinking that you were right, that I was building something I couldn't prove was safe until the moment of proof was also the moment of catastrophe, that the math might be wrong in ways I couldn't see, that $39.50 was a third of my operating reserve, and I was spending it on a room I hoped I'd never need against the advice of 3 people whose judgment I respected. What changed? Caleb asked. I read the coroner's report again, she said. All 3 pages. I had been carrying a copy in my coat pocket since September because I kept needing to remind myself what the certainty was built on. She looked at him directly. 4 names. Anders Halverson, 41 years old. Ingrid Halverson, 38. Tobias Halverson, 14. Clara Halverson, 9. They died in a barn that met every standard anyone in this territory would have told them was sufficient. They did everything right. They died anyway because the standards were wrong. A pause. I knew their names. That was enough to pick up the spade and go back to work. Caleb was quiet for a long time. The storm pressed against the barn's exterior with its sustained geological indifference, and inside the chamber, 17 people breathed and slept and kept each other warm in the space Eleanor had built for a family she had never met. I owe you an apology, he said finally. You don't, Eleanor said. You gave me the most important question. You expected me to answer it by stopping. I answered it by building an access panel. Both responses were honest. One of them happened to be more useful. Something shifted in his expression, the same recalibration she had seen the night before when the flue cleared and the candles resumed their proper lean. A young man revising a fixed position honestly, without defensiveness, in the way that would make him better at everything he did for the rest of his life. Britta Pulk spent the morning of the second day quieter than Eleanor had ever known her to be. She sat on the limestone floor with Oscar against her side, the boy now fully recovered and directing his 9-year-old energy toward an intricate project involving the spare buttons from someone's coat and lengths of string he had somehow acquired. Vera slept beside her in the deep, heavy way of late pregnancy, in a warm and genuinely safe place, the kind of sleep her body had been needing for weeks, Eleanor suspected. Britta watched her daughter sleep and said nothing for a long time. In the afternoon, she made her way through the crowded floor to where Eleanor was rechecking the fuel supply. I need to say something, Britta said. Eleanor waited. When I came to see your room last December, I told you that people die in underground rooms from bad air, that you were building this backwards, that you should build up, not down. Britta's English became more deliberate when she was navigating something emotionally complex, each word placed with care, as though she was building with materials she wanted to use correctly. What I told you about ventilation was true. The knowledge was real. She looked at the candle flames leaning toward the ports. But the force I used to say it, the certainty I carried, that was not knowledge. That was old fear wearing the clothes of knowledge. You had good reason for the fear, Eleanor said. I had reason, Britta said, but I used it as a weapon against something I hadn't fully understood, and that is different from sharing knowledge. You saw past the fear to what was actually true, and you fixed the thing that needed fixing. And last night, everyone in this room breathed safely because of both things, your willingness to listen and what I knew about air. She met Eleanor's eyes. That required a kind of judgment I did not give you credit for having. You came here in the blizzard, Eleanor said quietly, without knowing what I had built. You trusted something, even if you didn't call it that. My roof fell in, Britta said. I had no choice. You had a choice, Eleanor said. You could have sheltered in the ruin of your own house. You had the experience for it. You came here. She held the older woman's gaze. That was trust. even if you needed your roof to fall before you could act on it. Britta Pulk looked at her for a long moment. Then something in the iron-gray severity of her face softened into an expression that was beneath its reserve deeply human. The expression of a woman who has carried something difficult for a long time and has finally found a place to set it down. She reached out and put her hand over Eleanor's briefly and firmly in the manner of a woman who expressed the most important things through action rather than words. Then she went back to her daughter. The storm broke at 4 in the morning of the third day. Not gradually, not with the slow diminuendo that storms sometimes use to wind down, offering hope in installments. It broke the way it had arrived with abruptness, with a quality of finality, as though the Arctic system had simply completed its business and moved on to other territory. The sustained roar that had been the constant acoustic foundation of 43 hours dropped away in under 10 minutes, replaced by a silence so complete that Eleanor could hear Oscar Polk's slow sleeping breath from across the chamber. She was at the stove when it happened. She stood very still listening to the silence, making certain it was real rather than the temporary interval between gusts that the worst storms sometimes offered as a false promise. 1 minute. 2. The barn's continuous structural creaking, the sound of old cottonwood logs under sustained lateral pressure stilled itself. The high shrieking note that the wind had found in the barn's fabric disappeared. 5 minutes of silence. She crossed to the chamber door and opened it into the main barn. Dark, brutally cold. Her thermometer read 19 below zero, the temperature of aftermath, rather than crisis survivable in proper winter clothing with proper preparation. She moved her lantern through the space. 3 of her cows were dead, standing frozen in positions that looked in the lantern light almost peaceful, as though they had simply decided to stop and had stopped without drama. The 2 draft horses were alive. They turned their heads toward her light with the weary, patient recognition of animals that have endured something and understand it is over. She stood in the cold barn with her lantern, and she looked at the dead cattle, and she felt what she felt, sorrow, and also the particular cold, practical clarity of a person who has made a calculated sacrifice and is now accounting for the actual cost. 3 cattle against 17 people. The arithmetic was not in question. The sorrow was not in question either. Both things were true at once, and she held them both in the way the frontier required you to hold difficult truths without flinching, without pretending they were other than what they were. Then she went back into the chamber. "The storm has broken," she said. 17 people, most of whom had been sleeping in the light, restless way of people in an unfamiliar place, came awake. The quality of the waking was different from the previous 2 days, an alertness oriented outward toward the future, toward the world beyond the chamber door. It took 2 hours to dig out. The barn's main door had a drift packed against it to a height of 9 feet. Eleanor, Caleb, and Harlon Gaines worked from inside with shovels she had stored for winter emergencies. Standard shovels, heavy and reliable. Raymond spelled them in rotation. Gunner Ericson worked alongside with a wordless, focused efficiency that communicated both his enormous physical capability and his profound need after 43 hours of helpless warmth to be doing something that required his strength. They broke through to the outside at 6 in the morning. The light that came through the gap they had cut was the crystalline diamond-hard light of a Dakota winter morning after a major storm, a light with no mercy and no warmth, but an absolute devastating clarity that made everything it touched look more real than ordinary daylight. The sky was a deep, cold blue. The sun was at the horizon, still pale but present, unambiguously, irrevocably present. Eleanor stepped through first. She stood on top of the drift, which put her nearly 8 feet above the actual ground level of her farmyard, and turned slowly to look at what the storm had done to her world. The landscape was unrecognizable. Drifts had reached 17 feet on the eastern side of the barn, where the downwind accumulation had deposited everything the wind collected across 500 miles of open prairie. The chicken coop was buried entirely, its roofline invisible. The oak tree she had planted in her first spring on the claim planted because she had read that trees improve property value, and also because she had simply wanted to watch something grow, was reduced to a dark line barely visible above the drift at its base. The wind-sculpted formations across the eastern field rose and curved in patterns that looked almost deliberate, as though the storm had been making something rather than destroying something. They were, she thought, in the cold clarity of that morning, genuinely beautiful, the way destruction sometimes was utterly indifferent to human concerns, and therefore capable of a perfection that human-made things rarely achieved. She heard movement behind her. 17 people came through the gap she had cut, one by one, blinking in the hard winter light, stepping from the darkness of the barn into the crystalline morning. Oscar first immediately assessing the drifts with the eye of a 9-year-old evaluating their sledding potential. The Ericson children in a line staring at the transformed landscape with expressions that hadn't yet decided whether to become fear or wonder. Then the adults, Ellen Holt supporting Nora between herself and Raymond, the old woman moving carefully, but moving, breathing the cold air with difficulty, but breathing it. Vera Pulk stepping carefully, one hand on the barn wall. Harlon and his boys, Caleb. And last Britta Pulk, who stood in the gap and looked at the white transformed world, and then looked at Eleanor standing on top of the drift and said nothing. The things that needed saying had already been said in the warmth of the underground room, in the long second night when there was nowhere to hide from the truth. Eleanor turned slowly and counted for the final time, 17. Raymond Holt spoke first, and what he said was entirely consistent with everything Eleanor knew about him, direct, unembellished, the voice of a man who had spent his adult life in situations where clear communication was the difference between functional and catastrophic. He helped Nora to a position where she could stand supported against the barn wall in the thin winter sun. Then he straightened and turned to face the group gathered in the snow-covered farmyard, and he spoke at a volume sufficient to carry clearly in the still air. "I came to Eleanor Voss's barn last November," he said, "and I told her that what she was building was too complex, too risky, and unnecessary. I was wrong on all 3 counts." He looked at Eleanor steadily. Everything she built served a purpose. The reinforced ceiling held under a snow load that would have collapsed a standard structure. The ventilation system kept 17 people breathing through 2 nights in an enclosed space. The fuel supply was adequate. The provisions were adequate. The medical supplies kept my grandmother alive through a fever that, without them in that cold, would likely have killed her. A pause. "I have been wrong about things before. I will be wrong again. But I want to say clearly in front of everyone here that this was a serious wrong about a serious matter, and Eleanor Voss deserved better than the doubt I gave her." He said it in the farmyard at 19 below zero with frost on his coat and his grandmother breathing behind him. He said it the way a former military officer acknowledged a significant error, without hedging, without qualification, without the social softening that makes admissions easier to give and harder to receive. Eleanor looked at him across the packed snow. "You gave me the ceiling I needed," she said. "That's not nothing. That's possibly everything." He nodded once, accepting this, filing it, she suspected, not as absolution, but as information about how things actually worked, which was more useful. Then Caleb Marsh, who had been standing at the edge of the group with his hands in his coat pockets and his eyes on the middle distance, the way he stood when he was thinking through something he hadn't finished with yet, looked at Eleanor. "I told you there was no margin for error," he said. His voice was quiet, without theater carrying in the still air. "You answered me by building an access panel." A pause. "Last night that access panel kept 17 people from being slowly poisoned by their own fire in the shelter they were depending on to survive." He looked at her steadily. "I won't make the same kind of mistake twice. The kind where I let what I can't prove stop me from trusting what someone has actually built." He said it simply in the way of a young man who has learned something he expects to carry with him for a long time. Not dramatic, not performed, just honest, said in the open air in front of people who had been present for the thing being accounted for. Eleanor looked at him, and then at Raymond, and then at Britta, who was standing at the edge of the group with her hand on Vera's arm, and her face carrying the particular expression of a woman who has been through something large and is still in the process of understanding its dimensions. "We survived because of all of it," Eleanor said. "Everything everyone brought to this. What Raymond knew, what Britta knew, what Caleb understood about failure. The chamber worked because of what I calculated and because of what all of you gave me without intending to." She looked at the barn behind them, the old cottonwood structure that had sheltered 17 people through the worst storm in 30 years, not because of its own construction, but because of the room hidden inside it. "That's worth knowing. It's worth knowing for the next time." The news traveled faster than she expected. By the first week of December, people she had never met were writing to her claim, from distances she would not have considered reasonable for a social visit. They came from 40 miles south and 60 miles east, from homesteads whose names she knew only from the general store's bulletin board, from places that had their own losses from the storm cattle stored provisions. In 2 cases, structures that had not held and wanted to understand what Eleanor Voss had done and whether they could do the same. She showed every one of them. She walked them through the chamber and explained the construction in direct practical terms. The thermal mass principle, the way the Earth stored heat and released it, slowly moderating temperature swings that would have killed people in conventional structures. The sod insulation, 3 feet of packed prairie earth, providing an R value that no manufactured material currently available could match. The limestone floor, absorbing heat at the level where people lived and needed it most. The ventilation system, designed not just to provide airflow, but to make airflow visible and measurable, so that a problem could be caught before it became a catastrophe. The repair points built into the Flue system, because a design that couldn't be maintained under pressure was a design that would eventually fail at the worst possible time. She answered every question with the patience of a teacher who has learned that the quality of a question reflects the intelligence of the person asking it, and that frontier settlers were as a category far more intelligent than their circumstances were often given credit for. She gave away her drawings freely. Not rough approximations, but the actual working documents. The dimension plans, the load calculations, the ventilation rate formulas, the stove sizing parameters, the notes on material substitutions for situations where sod wasn't available or limestone was scarce. Everything she had worked out over 14 months, written out in clean copies, she prepared specifically because she understood from the moment the storm broke that what she had built would need to be replicated to do its full work. 43 homesteaders came in the first 2 months. By the following spring, 11 families had built chambers of their own, each adapted to their specific circumstances and available materials. Some freestanding, some attached to existing barns. Some using limestone throughout, some substituting sandstone from local creek beds. Some larger, designed for extended families. Some smaller, precisely calibrated for a single household's needs. All of them working from the same core principles. Use the earth as insulation in thermal battery build, in redundancy design for the worst scenario rather than the expected one, and build it to the standard that your life will require, rather than the standard that seems adequate when the weather is cooperative. Inspector James Whitworth came in the spring of 1883. He arrived from Chicago, sent by the Territorial Agricultural Extension Office, with surveying instruments and the carefully neutral expression of a trained professional who has encountered both genuine folk innovation and dangerous folk overconfidence, often enough to withhold judgment until the evidence is complete. He was perhaps 35, methodical, and clearly accustomed to finding that amateur engineering was less impressive than its advocates believed. He spent 3 full days in her chamber with his instruments and notebooks. He measured the sod wall's actual insulation performance and compared it to theoretical calculations. He tested the ventilation rate against contemporary standards for enclosed occupied spaces. He analyzed the stove sizing against chamber volume and the number of occupants she had described. He examined the load calculations for the ceiling and the actual performance data she had gathered during the storm, the temperature readings at 2-hour intervals, the fuel consumption rates, the timeline of the flue obstruction and repair. On the morning of the 4th day, he sat across from her at her kitchen table and read from his notebook without preamble. The sod insulation provides an R value of approximately 45:1, he said. This exceeds any commercially available insulating material currently on the market. Your thermal mass calculations are accurate to within 3% of my independent measurement, which is frankly a better result than I achieved with standard instruments on standard structures. The ventilation system exceeds current building code recommendations for enclosed occupied spaces by a significant margin. The stove sizing is optimal for the chamber volume and typical occupancy. The load calculations for the ceiling are conservative by a factor of approximately 1.8, which is precisely the right degree of conservatism for a life safety structure with no redundant support system. He looked up from his notebook. Your thermal performance figures exceed standard frontier construction by 340%. What you have independently developed incorporates principles of geothermal mass, passive thermal regulation, and stratified ventilation that are discussed in advanced engineering literature, but are rarely implemented in practical construction and essentially never in rural applications built entirely from local materials. He paused and she waited because she could tell he had saved something. Your ceiling reinforcement, he said. The doubled center supports and the redesigned load distribution connections at the wall interface. That modification is not in your original plans. When did you add it? November of 1881, Eleanor said. A neighbor pointed out that my original snow load calculation was insufficient for worst-case wind-driven accumulation. He had direct experience with the failure mode. Whitworth was quiet for a moment. That modification is the reason the ceiling didn't fail during the storm, he said. I've run the numbers. The snow load on your barn roof during peak storm conditions was 38 pounds per square foot. Your original design would have reached its failure threshold at approximately 28 pounds. The modified design held at 50 without any element approaching its limit. He looked at her. Your neighbor's observation saved 17 lives. His experience saved 17 lives, Eleanor said, which is different and possibly more important. He didn't give me the calculation. He gave me the reason to recalculate. Whitworth looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man encountering a distinction he hadn't previously considered. Then he wrote something in his notebook. The official report he filed with the Territorial Agricultural Extension Office concluded in the formal language of engineering assessment that Eleanor Voss had independently developed a shelter system superior to conventional frontier construction in extreme cold using entirely local materials based on principles that advanced institutional engineering had documented but not translated into practical rural application. The report recommended that the Territorial Extension Office disseminate her design principles across the Dakota homestead community as standard guidance for winter shelter construction. The Dakota Territorial Gazette ran a feature story. Letters arrived from Montana, Minnesota, Iowa, Ohio, from people who had read what she had done and wanted to build their own chambers before the following winter. She answered every letter enclosing drawings where she could and detailed instructions where she couldn't send drawings. When a reporter from Yankton interviewed her in the summer of 1883, he asked what she considered the single most important innovation, the key thing that made the difference. She thought about this for a long moment, about the thermal mass calculations she had worked out in the Yankton library, about the limestone floor that Ericson had described to her in November cold before he died, about the reinforced ceiling that Raymond Holt's fear had given her, about the ventilation system that Britta Pulk's knowledge had improved, about the access panel that Caleb Marsh's question had made necessary, about 17 people alive on a February morning in Dakota Territory. I didn't invent Earth-Bermed construction, she said. Norwegians have been building this way for centuries. The Mandan people built earth lodges using these same principles long before any European came to this territory. The innovation, if there is one, was being willing to learn from traditions outside my own experience. To take seriously what other people knew, including the people who disagreed with me, especially the people who disagreed with me. Opposition, when it comes from genuine knowledge, is not an obstacle. It's the most valuable resource available if you know how to receive it. The reporter wrote this down. She suspected he would use a shorter version of it, which was fine. The full version was for herself. Vera Polk's son was born in February of 1883, 3 months after the storm. He was healthy and strong-lunged and possessed of a clear opinion about the world that he communicated without reservation, beginning approximately 30 seconds after his arrival in it. Eleanor was there for the birth, as she had been present for a number of births on the frontier, not from formal training, but from the pragmatic availability that the frontier required of anyone who happened to be nearby when something important was happening and had the steadiness to be useful. She held Vera's hand through the hard parts and stayed afterward to help with the easier parts. And when Vera told her the name she had chosen, Eleanor held the baby for a long moment and looked at his face. Elias, the nearest male equivalent to Eleanor that Vera and Britta had been able to find in the names they knew. He was alive because of a coroner's report, because of $39.50, because of 14 months of evenings with a short-handled spade and a lantern and the 4 names of a family she had never met, because of 3 people who had tried to talk her out of a hidden chamber and had instead, without knowing it, made the chamber worth trusting with 17 lives. She held him for a while longer than was strictly necessary. Then she handed him back to his mother and walked home through February cold. That was brutal but ordinary manageable, the kind of cold that the frontier routinely produced and that people routinely survived with adequate preparation. She had been providing adequate preparation for 14 months. She intended to continue. She maintained the chamber for another 18 years until she sold the claim in 1900 and moved to Yankton to live with her niece. The family that bought her property used it continuously. Their children used it. Their children's children used it, adapting it modestly as their needs changed, adding shelving, replacing provisions, maintaining the structure with the care of people who understood what it had done and what it might be called to do again. In January of 1936, during the worst blizzard of the Dust Bowl years, The Svoboda family, 3 generations living on the land. Eleanor had proved up in the 1870s, sheltered 9 people in the chamber for 31 hours. The storm killed 47 people across South Dakota and Nebraska. Outside, the temperature dropped to 38 degrees below zero. Inside the chamber that Eleanor Voss had built by lantern light in the nights of 1881 and 1882, the temperature held at 69 degrees Fahrenheit. All 9 of them survived. The barn was torn down in 1957 when the property passed to a corporate farming operation that had no use for cottonwood log construction and no knowledge of what had happened in the winter of 1882. Engineering students from the state university documented the chamber before demolition, producing detailed drawings and measurements that captured everything Eleanor had built with a precision she would have appreciated. Those drawings are in the State Historical Society archives now. Modern analysis confirms what James Whitworth's 1883 report described: the thermal performance figures, the load calculations, the ventilation rates, the insulation values. All of it correct. All of it built by hand from local materials by a 34-year-old widow on a Dakota homestead who did the math and trusted it. Eleanor Voss died in 1918 at 70 years old in the Yankton house, where she spent her final years. She never remarried. She never built another chamber. She never sought recognition beyond what came to her without seeking, and she deflected most of that with a patience that people who knew her understood as something different from modesty. Closer, they said, to a fundamental indifference to how other people characterized work that she understood entirely on its own terms. She knew what the work had been. She knew what it had cost. She knew what it had done. That accounting was complete and required no external verification. The chamber is gone. The barn is gone. The oak tree she planted in her first spring on the claim is gone. Almost everything that was materially hers has been claimed by the century, and more since she stood on top of a drift in the diamond-hard light of a Dakota winter morning and counted 17 living people. But the earth is still there. It is always still there. Beneath the industrial fields that cover what was once her homestead, beneath the paved county roads and the utility lines and everything that 100 years of human effort has placed on top of the landscape, she knew the earth sits at 54 degrees year-round, below the frost line, the same temperature it held when Eleanor Voss read about it in an agricultural engineering journal, and understood with the clarity of a person who has found the solution to a problem she has been working for years what it meant. Unchanged, patient, indifferent to everything except the physics it has been enacting since before there were people to measure it. She had understood something that her neighbors hadn't. Not that the earth was an obstacle to survival, but that it was the most reliable tool for survival available to anyone willing to work with it, rather than against it. She had not defeated the Dakota winter. She had found the layer beneath the winter, the constant and untouchable warmth below the frost line, and she had built something that connected the people above to the protection below. That was the whole of it. That was everything. The best time to build a shelter is long before you need one. Eleanor Voss knew that. She knew it from a coroner's report and 4 names she carried in her coat pocket through 14 months of solitary work. She knew it before the storm gave her proof, and before 17 people crowded into a room she had built for 6, and before the thermometer outside read 42 below, while the thermometer inside held steady at 71. That kind of knowing, and the kind that moves a person to act without the comfort of certainty to spend money they can't entirely spare on a structure they hope will never be needed to keep building through the opposition of people whose judgment they genuinely respect, is rarer than any engineering skill, and worth more than most of us tend to acknowledge until the wind hits 78 miles an hour, and the temperature drops to 42 below, and there is nowhere left to go except into the shelter someone had the courage to build. 9 people alive in 1936. 17 people alive in 1882. 1 widow on the Dakota frontier who did the math and kept knowing 4 names and did not stop. That is not just history. That is the oldest lesson the land has to offer, stated plainly in the language of limestone and sod, and a small stove burning 8 pounds of cottonwood per day against the longest night of the longest storm in 30 years. The earth is still there, 54 degrees year-round, waiting below the frost line, exactly where Eleanor Voss found it. It has always been waiting. It will keep waiting, patient and constant and warm for whoever has the sense to use it.